Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for showing such hospitality to my colleagues and I. And please do continue to find us during the breaks and the meals. It's been a pleasure having conversations with many of you already. I want to get started, as Jeff mentioned, by talking about some of the approaches to change making that give me hope. But to do that, I need to get real, firstly, about some of the downsides of disruption. Because when we talk about disruption, the odds are not in our favor. You heard David Roberts asking yesterday how many people made it from the spice trade to the ice trade, or from the ice trade to the refrigeration business. And the answer was reliably zero, because a small number of companies disrupt, and a large number of companies are disrupted. Ramez introduced you to some of the research about how long companies can remain on the Standard & Poor's 500 list in the United States. The research that he was quoting was published in 2012, and they said it is about 15 years you can enjoy. Last century, middle of last century, it was a dynasty. It was generations of relevance and dominance. Now it was down to 15 years. It's already down to 12 years, just in the last 6. Every 2 weeks, a company falls off of this list. I don't know anybody who's forecasting a reversal of this trend, which means that the relevant period of your business dominance is shrinking. I do know people who are trying to beat the odds. And if you're a major business and you know that about how long you might last, what do we know about startups? Ask yourselves, and actually feel free to shout out an answer. If there's a new startup that just gets going right now, what are the chances that it will fail in the first year or two? What have you heard? A little louder, somebody? 90? Anybody think higher, lower? All the answers that I heard were above 50%. Everybody knows at least 50% of the startups will fail. A lot of the research says 70 to 80%. It varies market and industry. But high-growth tech startups are studied very closely. Venture capital has studied them closely for obvious reasons. And we know that those startups, they do fail more than 90% of the time. So people do try to beat the odds. They come to conferences like this one. And even if you went to conferences like this one once a quarter, you can't possibly stay aware of all of the different disruptions that might impact your company or your society. When you have the power, the network, and the safety, you might still think, you know what, I'm gonna take my chances. I'm gonna play around with disruption. And if you have the timing, you might be lucky. But what about the people who are not in the room? How do people in societies around the world prepare for a cascade of disruptions that will change the workings of their everyday lives? How will governments or civil society organizations prepare to endure? One of the things that I like about the Thailand 4.0 initiative is that it specifically calls out two of its chief priorities are looking at increased social well-being and raising human value. A lot of the things that I'll be talking to you about over the next 35 minutes or so fall in that category. I like this graph from a very popular technology blog called Wait But Why. It's trying to illustrate to you the dizzying, confusing moment when the speed of technological advances starts doing what it's doing this decade. And every person, every organization, every government is represented by that tiny little figure right there. I also like to think of this as representing not just an exponential curve that's zoomed way out, but what Jeff Rogers talked to you about yesterday, the law of accelerating returns, where a series of exponential technological trends come together and accelerate one another so that the changes are happening at a dizzying pace. I'd also propose that there's a corollary to the law of accelerating returns, which is the law of accelerating externalities. Amin Tufani mentioned this to you yesterday. He talked about exponential losers. Right? It's a harsh phrase, but the reality is that the downside risk of some of these technological disruptions are considerable. And I want to talk about some of those with you today. If you were in the session on technological unemployment at lunch, or if you were in the plenary after that, you know that we were talking through the risk that some of these technologies put jobs at risk. One of the most worrying studies from Thailand's perspective that came out on this was in 2016. Citigroup, that giant bank, helped to fund this study along with researchers at Oxford University. They specifically called out Thailand as having a 72% overall vulnerability to technological automation in the next couple decades. Last year, a more updated study from the International Labor Organization still put that at 44%. Either one of these numbers is almost impossible to comprehend and is totally destabilizing. Even if the number was 15% in the next 20 years, that would be really hard to plan for. One of our biggest risks is that we prepare for this and other transitions badly. So before I pivot into some of the things that I think can help us prepare, I want to address two of the lines of thinking that may weaken our preparedness. What do people say we should do to prepare? Well, one of the first things is that they look at people and they just say, race, reskill every couple of years, become an expert in technology, study science, technology, engineering, and math. We're looking at an exponential curve going like this, and we're telling individual people to keep up with it. It's the same advice that we give to corporations. Even for corporations, it's a little dodgy, but for individuals, it's not that appropriate. And I'll give you two reasons why before moving off of this one. We've talked a little bit about the proliferation of the gig and freelance economies. In the US, for instance, by 2020, it's forecast that more than 40% of the workforce will be gig or freelance. That means there's no job security. It means that there are no benefits. It means that there's incredible downward pressure on wages. Just what we saw with sweatshops, in manufacturing, in textiles in the last decades, we're already starting to see with high-tech digital skills. If you've gone on to online labor marketplaces, you may have engaged people who are essentially working in digital sweatshops, coders with high-tech skills getting a couple dollars an hour to work on your enterprise software project. That is already the broken promise of STEM manifesting in certain areas. The other problem with this is that even if you can race effectively against an exponential curve for a certain amount of time, you are still not exponential. No matter what our motto is, that exponential curve will outpace you. And many of the new areas of employment that come online and they support fewer workers than past industries for shorter periods of time than past industries. So what's the other prescription that we often give to the citizenry? If they're not going to race, we tell them to gamble. We tell them, be an entrepreneur. We need more startups in this region. We need more people taking the risky step of starting businesses, but we already talked about what the failure rate is for those. More than half of the people that try this will fail. And this is not acknowledging of the fact that huge portions of our population cannot afford to fail even one time at business. They cannot afford to fall into debt. They cannot afford to look after the health and well-being of their children, of the people that depend upon them, by failing in that way. Asking people to gamble, asking people to race is great for talent scouting. If you fund the race, if you're finance, you win either way. You back the winner, you get those gains, and you might get the collateral and the resources of all the losers at the same time. There's a reason that these suggestions are popular, but they're not healthy writ large across a society that's encountering real high-speed disruptive changes. I think that what these two risky suggestions have in common is that they focus too much attention on the individual. Vulnerable people should not be given the same advice as corporations. It's as if we can only imagine improvements to individual transport instead of public transportation. As if all we want are newer, cooler cars, flying cars, and we don't want to actually redesign how we live. The fact that that's actually what's happening in industry and in city after city around the world is just proof that that's how we think and how we fail to think. This type of approach just rewards a small number of already privileged people and creates instability. The flip side of this is that it's also dangerous not to consider the individual enough when we're looking at our solutions. I'd encourage you, if you're starting to play with the idea of like machine vision or algorithms and incorporating them into your business, into your municipality, that you check out this book. It was just published a few months ago by Eugenia Banks. And she's pointing out with her research that our prejudice, our biases, are already being baked into the technologies that we're developing. So racial biases or gender biases are now being automated so that certain people can't access certain services. Amin Tufani shared with you that example of the Chinese government profiling faces to predict criminality. Imagine how that would go in my country, where if a black person gets pulled over, they get ticketed, and if a white person doesn't, they probably don't. So you get this database that makes it look like black people are criminals, when in reality the law is being enforced unevenly, and when there are elements of structural inequality that caused that skew in who is called a criminal. Well, now once you bring that into technology, you're like, oh no, this is rational, this is science. Taking that step and not being aware of what you might bake in is a dangerous thing to do. Please caution yourself and inform yourself about the downside risks there to care for your populations better. I said we'd start talking about some of the solutions that give me hope in the face of these concerns that I raised. We'll do that for the rest of the talk. One of the key concepts that I'd encourage you to explore is ownership design. Ramez spoke with you yesterday, and in the context of giving you advice about innovation, he pointed out that new business models are very relevant in a time of rapidly changing and disruptive technologies. The cutting-edge discipline of ownership design is arising as a response to highly centralized, non-democratic technology behemoths. Right now, if someone came up to us and said, I'm building a new search engine, or I'm building the next social network, a lot of us would think that person is an idiot. The incumbents in those spaces are decades into building up huge war chests of capital. They have massive network effects. They have sensitive data in economies all around the world. Within their paradigm of business, they're too hard to go head-to-head against. But the website that's listed on this, ioo.coop, is tracking a whole arena of economic upstarts who are going head-to-head in their own completely different way against these giant technology companies. And it's not like a giant killer will emerge from this that you can invest in and that will become newly dominant in a zero-sum game. That's not what it means. It means that the territory, the economic terrain of these centralized platforms is just getting nibbled away at, subculture by subculture, community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, and the space is being reclaimed with new technologies and new approaches to ownership design. I'll talk to you about, first, what it looks like when we don't do ownership design. Uber and Airbnb are usually praised at technology conferences as democratizing things, helping us share, helping us collaborate, these wonderful tools. And they do enable people to monetize their time and their belongings in new and convenient ways. But they do that while centralizing an enormous amount of power, wealth, and data in a small number of hands, hands that are often not in your nation or even your region in the world. They enable new forms of discrimination that our laws are not keeping up with. They often stand in direct conflict with democratically elected municipalities, with regulations, with citizenries. Their workers have no vote and little voice in any of the policies that affect their livelihood. And the position of the worker in each is in the crosshairs of automation very explicitly. One of the tools of the ownership design movement is the Platform Cooperative. I'll talk to you about a few of those so you can get a sense of what they are. Let's say you want to go online and buy some goods. Baskets, clothes, something like that. You could go onto eBay. You could buy something on eBay, and then the big percentage of your transaction would go to further enrich the eBay mafia, hanging out as already billionaires in Silicon Valley. Or you could go and you could sign on to Fairmondo if you're in a couple different countries in the world. This is a digital marketplace that's entirely owned by the merchants who are selling things on that digital marketplace. They have a cooperative business structure, so they're making their decisions together. They're deciding how to improve their marketplace, how to change their policies in a way that's fair to all of them. And these guys got started in Germany a couple years ago. They're letting people all around the world use their brand and use their technology stack and start their own versions of Fairmondo. No problem. They're not even trying to franchise it in a traditional way where they get the profit off of all of these. They just want to copy and paste that solution around the world. Stocksy was started by a bunch of photographers who would take high-quality images, and previously they would upload them to sites like Flickr. And then Flickr would take a big portion of the rights, of the royalties rather, when someone would buy that image. And the stock photographers at a certain point, they're like, why are we doing this? Why are we giving so much money to Flickr? It's not that hard to build one of these things. So now they have their own platform. It's got awesome images. They run the whole thing and they get more of the profit. This is a direct result of the exponential increase in the price performance of computing power. Because to try to do this kind of thing 10 or 15 years ago as a bunch of basket weavers or photographers was not realistic. You needed engineering talent that would have cost you millions of dollars a year for your database architecture, for your UI UX design, for configuring your servers, for managing and defending your servers, all of those things were difficult. None of those things are difficult anymore. So we're still kind of enthralled to these companies that were really impressive 15 years ago, but all they have is network effects. But they've also got a lot of bad blood around the world. There's a big opportunity to step in and do what they do because it's no longer magic. You don't even have to be what people think of as a producer. So the third annual Platform Cooperative event took place in New York last November. These guys caught my eye because it markets itself as a marketplace for patient insights, medical patient insights. Those people don't produce anything, right? They're not like weaving things for you. They just have had a disease or had a sickness, and they have information about how it affected them. They have information about the different treatments that they underwent, how it made them feel, how they were treated. So this is now a marketplace where they're selling that information back to medical companies that want to distinguish themselves in the market, in the larger market, by being patient-centric, customer-centric. and caring about, people. So they've actually created a two-sided marketplace around that. If you go on ioo.coop, you will see where these projects are, pretty much every continent on Earth, and you'll see more than 200 of them, many of them brand new. 4 years ago, there were 8. We talked before about the rate of failure of businesses, how high it is. The research on cooperatives is much more hopeful. So, the Mondragon Cooperative Network in Spain is one of the most researched, most mature, most expert places for cooperatives in the world. They spin up cooperatives like every month, tons and tons of them. There's hundreds of cooperatives in their network. They've researched those cooperatives, and they find that the cooperatives that they found have an 80% chance of being in business 5 years on. That's a 10x increase in survivability of a business over what we were talking about before. It's staggering that people don't do that math and plan differently, because it means that all of these businesses I'm talking to you about, no matter how humble or weird or quirky they sound, they have a 10x greater likelihood, potentially, of lasting. There's a couple other reasons why I expect exponential growth in the platform cooperative ecosystem. Here's one of them. ShareTribe is a Finnish company. Just last month, they smashed their fundraising target in a crowd equity round, raised well over a million and a bit euros, so that they can provide the establishment of platform cooperatives as a service. They're a platform cooperative helping you build a platform cooperative. So they'll come to your agricultural cooperative, they'll come to your municipality, and they'll help you configure a platform cooperative that you can then run off and use on your own. They had investors from more than 40 countries in a short period of time, interest all around the world. Just 2 weeks ago, super fresh headline, Google.org gives a platform cooperativism consortium $1 million. What for? To build a kit of open source tools specifically to build platform cooperatives in childcare, home care, elder care, and recycling. That's really smart. If you're looking at which industries grow, which industries aren't getting disrupted, childcare, home care, elder care, these aren't going anywhere. Recycling, this is a very targeted, intelligent investment in tomorrow's digital infrastructure. Blockchain technologies, which you learned a little bit about yesterday, are also powerful fuel for experiments with ownership design. We spoke about Airbnb. This is one of their new competitors in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, we also talked, we're like, why? And they raised good money, they have great talent, and they're live right now, catering to people. But why? Why would anyone use this site when they have no network effects at all? Well, if you have a home and you want to host it on this site, they're going to take 0 fees. None. Okay, well then what about the renter? What about the guest? The guest pays 0 fees. Nobody pays any fees who uses this site. How do they do that? A couple different ways. One, it's in the crypto space. They want you to use their own token. So you pay 0 fees if you use their token. If you try to pay with a Visa card, pay some fees. Other, they like their technology. They're going to license it to other industries. They'll make their money that way. And they, by leveraging blockchain, they have the ability probably to keep their costs down in places where Airbnb is probably still paying for kind of staff and older school processes. Because when you're thinking about technological automation, don't just think about artificial intelligence and robotics. Blockchain is also a source of removing job layers, bureaucrat layers, authenticating layers. Another innovation in ownership design coming out of the Bay Area is the city of Berkeley itself. These guys just initiated what I think will definitely be a globally trend-setting pilot program. The city of Berkeley is launching their own municipal bonds on their own blockchain. Who got cut out of that picture? Finance, big banks. Typically, a municipality would have to they'd have to spend a lot of time and money convincing a bank to launch bonds for them, and that bank would get a huge percentage of those bonds. The city would get a fraction of the money that they raised. That's ridiculous. It's not that hard to do bonds anymore. If you want to do them transparently in a way that nobody can hack or mess with, you put them on a blockchain, you run them yourself. Then you have the advantage also that your city's developing skills in its own authority around these things, in its own technology around those things, and you're having it transparent. So the citizenry has a different attitude about finance and municipal governance. Plus, the open and transparent way that this happens means that you can start copying that solution in municipalities around the world. You think if you went to Berkeley and said, hey, can you show us how they do that? They'd say there's going to be a licensing fee. That's a secret. No way. They want this everywhere. They want this everywhere yesterday. An even more ambitious civic tech solution has been making headlines in recent months. Digital Town is a publicly traded company that wants to bring to cities total sovereignty over their own technology stack. They say that they're powering cities to be their own Airbnb, OpenTable, Amazon, Expedia, and PayPal all in one. Because they say, why do you need to be trying to regulate or fight with these companies that aren't even doing anything that magical? We can set you up with layers and layers of different platform cooperatives, teach you how to manage them, and then run with it. That's 21st century digital architecture. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You will not be surprised to know that there's a blockchain layer available here, hyperlocal tokens that can be given or sold to the population to enable or track voting, transactions of all kinds. One of the interesting things is there was a big controversy around these guys recently, and it came from within the platform cooperative community. They were saying, is it real? Like, are they really going to give the power to the city, or is this a long-term profit play and then the city loses its sovereignty? You know, we'll see which it turns out to be. I'm fascinated by the proof of concept that within the platform cooperative ecosystem, it only took 2.5 years for a publicly traded company to see the opportunity, come in and start selling it to, guess who their first 2 customers are? Dallas in Texas, Austin in Texas, huge cities with many billions of dollars of budget, millions of people. Seattle and London are signing up. These are not small victories. These are huge ecosystems tilting towards a totally different way of doing business. The co-founder of Coinbase, one of the most successful cryptocurrency exchanges, has said, in the next 10 years, we'll learn more about governance than we did in the last 100. The crypto space is normalizing transparency of risk mitigation, of conflict resolution, of process. Now, a Slack channel or a public forum is the boardroom. That's how involved people are in the key decisions. How will that community respond to sabotage, disruption, theft? What if their preparations are wrong? What if they were tricked? What if they're deceived? You get to see behind the curtain. You get to be behind the curtain, participating in, learning in that. This is so far beyond understanding the prisoner's dilemma or iterated prisoner's dilemma or last century's economic thinking. This is years of fast iteration circles in the trenches, building and living in tomorrow's digital infrastructure layers. We need to make sure that the we in Fred's sentence actually applies to everyone on Earth. That these governance lessons are not just being learned by tiny little groups of certain groups of people in certain places. The opportunity is to involve your population, your workforce, everyone in this type of learning. I'll introduce a few more approaches to change-making that move us in this direction as well. I'll give you my 2 favorite examples about participatory budgeting. If they resonate, if you want to learn more about it, check out the book on the left. The first 30 pages tell you everything you know about all the research on participatory budgeting in the last 30 years. The picture on the top right is really simple phones, dumb phones, charging in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a country that's had a horrible run of treatment. It's very difficult to govern. It didn't have a very healthy government layer. And in South Kivu, the Open Development Technology Alliance ran a multi-year participatory budgeting experiment with those citizens that let them use their dumb phones to send text messages and then tell the government where to spend the money. So in 3 or 4 years, they built 54 classrooms, they built a number of health clinics, they repaired and improved their sewage infrastructure. That's not that surprising. Seems like things citizens would want to do. What is surprising is in the same period, they found a 16-fold increase in tax collection in South Kivu. There was not some separate pilot program of like exponential tax collectors going around. This was the same place it was before, where you could dodge tax collection very effectively for a long time. Think about your own informal economy. How many people can choose what they want to pay in taxes? Tell you what they want to tell you about what they made. Same thing. Letting them spend this money made them 16 times more likely to pay money to the government because they started believing in that layer once again. And it doesn't just have to be like dumb phones and some kind of ugly tech. The city of Long Beach in California is using elegant map-based user interface to let the citizens imagine where different things, parks, improvements might be placed. And the other example I really like is in New York City, where about half a decade ago, 4 city councilors. City council in New York is kind of an embarrassing layer of government. It has been more corrupt than other layers of government for quite a while. These 4 city councilors said, we will run participatory budgeting initiatives. Within 4 years, 27 city councilors are running participatory budgeting initiatives. That's more than half of that entire government layer in less than half a decade, all embracing this. Well, why? If you're running a participatory budgeting initiative and I start campaigning against you as a trustworthy white guy who should spend all the money however he sees fit, I've got an uphill battle convincing people to give back the power that my opponent has given to them. There's a ball that gets rolling here and some intelligences that get rolling here that actually you want in your country. And if you want to get a sense of how to use this, if you want to try it in your own family, in your own company, in your own municipality, you can download CoBudget. It's a free and open source tool coming out of a tech collective called Inspiral in the United States. And it lets you very simply set aside some funds and then debate about where they go and then allocate them in that direction. One of the things that I liked, an experiment that they did, is they took a bunch of companies that were values aligned, thought of them kind of as a consortium. And those companies each put some money into this co-budget instance, and then the companies all went back and forth and would say, oh, can you loan it to us? We need to buy this new machine and we'll pay it back at, or maybe we can all together invest in Y. And they all had this open strategy going back and forth. Beyond that, they had a way to send money back and forth to each other's projects with no tax ramifications and no fees. They had a walled garden, their own microeconomy. That's new. What do you want to do with that? Democracy Earth is putting participatory budgeting onto the blockchain. So they want to add a whole bunch of extra trust to it. They also want a smart contract layer so that after the decision is made, the action happens automatically. Because you could still do participatory budgeting, ask where all the citizens want to spend the money, and do whatever you want with it. That would be normal politics. But if you include a layer of smart contracts, you can actually force the money to go where the people said. When you're trying to rebuild trust in corrupt systems, that's a pretty cool proposition. The other thing they're doing is they're helping to build on representative democracy. Representative democracy is old. It comes from old infrastructure. It's where you get to vote very rarely on a small number of people, and then you just have to sit back and watch as they ruin your country. It's not the nicest way to go. In delegative or liquid democracy, you get to choose who represents you on an issue-by-issue basis. You all could elect me or delegate me to be your representative on homelessness issues. But then if I vote or I come up with a policy that you think is really bad, you can immediately take your vote away from me. So overnight, I can be stripped of my power because I betrayed you. This totally changes the dialogue in politics. One thing that makes people nervous when they hear that is they're like, oh, but the population, they might be misinformed. They could be misled into electing the wrong person, or they could be deceived into voting for the wrong thing. My Vote have built their company trying to address exactly that problem, trying to layer into the civic process some checks and balances and educational opportunities. So let's say you're going to have a big amendment about, say, immigration policy, and there's some newspapers that are lying about what it means. And the population is confused now because there's people that are lying about it. Before they vote on the policy, they can go through kind of a quiz. And if it turns out that they're misinformed, they can be taken and shown exactly where in the policy the relevant statements are and what those impacts can be. You can have a neutral, transparent process for determining what that looks like, and then only allow the vote to go through when the citizens are at least accurate about whose policies are what and which implications come from those policies. This is doing well already. They've been piloting this for a while in Australia. They're literally starting a pilot program in India this year, and they're in talks with the government of Malaysia. Right, so this is farther along than you might think when you first hear about it. The two technologies I'll talk about next are also about empowering people and including people within the digital world. So Sway, just last month, was awarded top honors at a Swedish competition around governance tech. There were 14,000 entrants into it, and these guys came out on top. What they're trying to do is help to include marginalized, disadvantaged, vulnerable voices in conversation by using artificial intelligence to better understand, package, and present their viewpoints to management and decision makers. So right now, you might have brilliant ideas coming from your cleaning staff or your lowest level, but they're not putting it into a proposal and cross-linking it with things and giving it to you in a way that you find respectable or actionable. Those skills aren't that hard. Artificial intelligence can do some of those skills for those people. So it's a way of trying to translate between layers of society so that insights reach where they need to reach. Cortico made headlines just a month or two ago because Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, basically announced he needs help, and he's looking to them. It's a new startup that spun out of MIT's social technology lab, and their aim is to measure the health of public conversations. If you've been on Twitter recently, especially if you've been on some parts of Twitter, you know that the quality of the health of that conversation can be a little bit troubled. You can find it can be very angry, it can be very hateful, it can be full of misinformation. Same on Facebook, same on other social platforms. And so the idea that you start to bring machine learning and the latest of technology to identify where something is unhealthy and what might make it more healthy. It's interesting. You could run this on your own Slack channel. You could run this on your own internal comms. You just have to consider it important. And if all these things that I'm talking about seem like really idealistic and you're like, these are silly little experiments, we've probably got 15 years before they're relevant, you're not following the money at all. About 5 years ago, the digital design principles were signed on to by major organizations around the world that represent well over $100 billion and are in well over 180 countries. Most UN organizations have signed on to this: Unicef, UNHCR, UNDP, the entire World Bank Group, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USAID, DFID, Australia, literally 100 signatories, all of them deep pockets of public money, saying that they will only fund you when you try to solve hunger, energy problems, education. If you're trying to help with the Sustainable Development Goals, you align with these principles. Some of them are soft and fuzzy. Number 6 is a really big deal. They're only going to give you public money if you're putting your solutions back into the public, on GitHub, into the Creative Commons, not licensing them back to other countries and making a pile of money. All of the companies that were doing that before, making good money on it, can't anymore. Some of them can't even pivot fast enough to change their business models. Here's one of the things that looks like. UNICEF launched an innovation fund recently. The excitement about this fund was so great, they had to cap investment at $10 million within a couple weeks. Investors were not even looking for return. They had one condition. They would fund what UNICEF Innovation said was worthwhile if the funded entity put the solution into the public domain. So you've got a magic water filter, you've got a blockchain solution for identifying refugees. Great. We'll give you money, you build it, give it away. That solution should be copied and pasted all around the world in every struggling country within a month. If you're not doing that, you're letting your selfishness and your attachment to last century's business models restrict the narrow, wonderful gift that you had an idea that for a moment could keep up with exponential technologies. When we're looking at these curves going like this, do you have time to slowly establish controlled dominance of one market and then another and then you're global? No. 5 years from now, your innovation is irrelevant. Completely and 100% irrelevant. Why didn't you make it reach everywhere on Earth when it was important? Ampli is one of their early investments in this fund. It's a blockchain company. They're in South Africa. They've already been used by 77 schools to collect 55,000 attendance records. They save teachers 4,000 hours a month of their record keeping. You like what they do? Copy and paste it wherever you are. And it's their parent company, the IXO Foundation, is looking at all sorts of ways to use the blockchain to track meaningful impact. So for instance, are conservation projects working effectively in Madagascar? Can we crowdsource evidence of the compliance of the people delivering on those contracts? Another fascinating open approach. And it's not just the digital development principles and all those major organizations. The Creative Commons Foundation, which you may know as the folks that do copyleft licenses, licenses that permanently protect the openness of your intellectual property, they also are a powerful lobbying branch. They're running around, talking to different governments, different branches of government, and fundamentally changing how their budgets get spent. This is what it looks like. They go to the Department of Labor in the United States, who have a $2 billion annual budget for how community colleges and trade schools work. Now, every dollar of that $2 billion annual budget has to be spent on building things that go out into the open, into Creative Commons, onto GitHub. Before that, they could give $2 billion to Pearson to make a bunch of textbooks that Pearson would change like 5% one year to the next and get the same $2 billion next year. So you had companies just feeding off government contracts, keeping all of this stuff secret and not even very high quality. Now it's all open. Now that $2 billion gets to go in renewed and exciting and interested directions. The Department of Education followed suit. That's $4.5 billion a year going into open educational resources. And the bigger deal here is what this means is literally every young mind in America that's not going to a fancy private school is growing up using open educational resources. That's their reality. Those are their assumptions. This is a total generational paradigm shift. And if you're not watching it happen and you're still trying to protect your terrain in old-fashioned ways, your terrain won't exist. Here's a non-US based example. The government of Bulgaria passed the Electronic Governance Act. Now, any piece of software developed for the government of Bulgaria has to be developed open source in a public repository. So you can't just give your cousin a contract to build crappy government software. It's kind of amazing. There's probably not a single government in the world that doesn't have crappy government software that was built at some point non-transparently by someone that was not the best bid. Though we've spoken primarily about the impact of disruption on individuals or governments and businesses, we cannot disregard how we are disrupting Earth systems. When you see exponential trends in Earth systems, that's way scarier than seeing it in business. To look more closely at the trends that are just represented here visually, please check out the work of Johan Rockström, the Stockholm Resilience Center, explore planetary boundaries. It's really important that this become part of your framework for decision making. But I've zoomed out to this layer just to point out that ownership design can actually help with this type of problem, with the planet, with ecology, with the environment as well. We've applied ownership design to industry, governance, finance, intellectual property. What about land itself? One of the most transformational trends of this generation, probably the whole middle of the 21st century, is giving legal personhood to natural entities. It got started in Ecuador a few years ago, and then it jumped over to New Zealand, where they gave legal personhood to a river, to a forest, to a mountain. This is not a publicity stunt. This is not for a storybook. This is litigatable. It means that if there's a company that's polluting a river, you can take that company to court for hurting a person. Before, you would have to find the money to conduct a long study to say that maybe a child might get cancer in 5 years. Nobody had that money. Nobody could stop that pollution. Nobody could stop that abuse. When you give legal personhood to natural entities, you can protect them much better. And when you think of what happened when we gave legal personhood to companies, companies used to be on corporate charters. The population got to decide every 5 years if they got to keep being a company. So they acted very nice. When we took that away and we said they're people, and they never die, and they have all the rights, they went on a growth spurt. They've been on a binge all around the world, accumulating power and influence. When you give that same set of power back to nature, that's a fantastic opportunity to counterbalance some of the abuses that you're used to without having to protest or change what you already did. You just say, this worked good for growing companies, maybe it'll help grow our environment out of the terrible situation that it's in. And right near here, India, just last year, gave legal personhood to lakes, to forests, to waterfalls, to glaciers, to the Ganges. Pittsburgh, Santa Monica, the nation of Bolivia. This is being explored all over the place. There's even a company, the only one I know of, is formed to accelerate this trend that brings together experienced technology entrepreneurs, indigenous rights activists, legal scholars, to help people in all kinds of different countries explore what it would look like to give legal personhood to a piece of nature where they are. And then they take it a step further, which is pretty interesting. They're like, all right, say you're a company and you've got a river that's beautiful, it runs by your headquarters, or a forest where you get some of your paper from. Why don't you put that forest on your board? Give it a board seat. Why don't you give it some dividends? Why doesn't it get like 1% of your profit? And then a community of people that are stewarding that resource, using ownership design, get to decide how that river will spend its money. Maybe it will buy up its riverbanks, push back a little bit of space, plant some trees. Maybe it wants to buy its watershed. Maybe it's alluvial plains. Those are fascinating discussions to be having, imaginative, creative, future-looking conversations to have. So I want to suggest in general that if you aren't thinking about ownership design, if you aren't thinking about spreading your solutions rapidly and horizontally, you're limiting your vision. You're also limiting your impact. You're allowing your potential impact to be hoarded amongst the most prosperous of us. Cities like this are what result from business as usual. We must think carefully about how to include more people in the learning, the profit, and the ownership of what we do, because we don't need more moonshot soloists. We need to become a moonshot species. Thank you very much.